Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's May 8, 2020, and today we're speaking about gnats with Dr. Sally Bamford, 2018 PhD graduate in art history from the Australian National University. Hello, Sally.
Hello, Luke. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you here. So, let's get started. What is a gnat in Myanmar now, and what do they do?
Okay, well, a gnat, very simply, is a spirit. The closest Western explanation of the concept would be a spirit. But they can be spirits that are good and help you in your life, or they can be spirits that range from like just pesky and make your tyre go flat to downright malicious and, give you COVID-19 and make you die. So there's a huge range. In terms of what they can do, a lot of belief around the gnat, you ask 20 people, you're going to get 20 slightly different answers. Gnats can do a lot, but I don't think anyone would believe that they could make inanimate objects fly, for example, like a poltergeist in the Western tradition, although there are probably people who say that they could. I think there are probably a lot of people out there, believers, who believe a gnat can pretty much do anything. But a lot of the belief today seems to be around the gnats and illness. So it'd be interesting to see in these times with the pandemic whether offerings to the gnats have ramped up to a large degree because of the pandemic. So, yeah, there were some people from Yangon University who did a study into Natgador, who were the spirit mediums in Yangon, and they found that something like 98% of them believed that an illness could be cured by making an offering to the gnats. And that was a study that was only done about 2016, I think, so it's not that long ago. So despite that, Myanmar has rapidly modernised in the last sort of 20, 30 years, there are, the belief that the gnats cause illness is still very much at the forefront. In terms of what else they can do, well, the beneficial gnats are kind of the Dewa that live in the Buddhist heavens. And the king of those Dewa is the Jamin, or Saka, or Sakra in the Pali or Sanskrit. So he's seen as the king of the gnats, and he's like a beneficial angel, I suppose, and people can make offerings to him for assistance in their lives. So he's kind of very much tied in with Buddhism. And the other gnats range from things like the gnat of the farmer's field. The farmer would make an offering to the gnat to make sure that the crops grow well. And at the end of the season, a little bit like Thanksgiving, there might be another offering to the gnat to thank him for a bountiful harvest. You see them in urban areas a lot, those kind of offerings a lot as well. Yangon taxis often have red and white ribbons tied around their rearview mirrors or around the gear stick or something, and they're again offerings to the gnat of the road or even the gnat of the car to make sure that everything mechanically is going to run smoothly. So they can pretty much do a lot, but mostly it's about ensuring good things happen or making sure bad things don't happen. And
so the main sort of interface with the people in Myanmar now and gnats is to do with offerings.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's always been a case of honouring the gnat and making sure that you are paying the gnat respect, because the gnat is the lord of the land or of the location or the space that you're moving around and within. And if you don't acknowledge the gnat's hegemony over that space and land and so on, then the gnat is going to be offended, and you don't want to offend a gnat. So there's a lot of respect in the way that offerings are made. I think it's the same as with the respect that's shown the Buddha. Offerings are given to the Buddha. Offerings to the gnats are physically different, but they often include Buddhist elements. So the standard offering to the gnat is an unripe coconut and some couple of hands of unripe bananas. And you sometimes see them dressed up with gold or silver foil. and that's the sort of the standard offering to the nat. They like to drink juice from the unripe coconut. When the coconut is ripe, it's sort of believed that the nat has drunk, and that the ripened coconut is removed, and new green ones come in. And that has a lot to do with a tradition around one of the oldest nat legends. But often these offerings will include little paper white umbrellas or silver or gold foil umbrellas, and the umbrella is an offering that's associated with the Buddha. So there are these overtly Buddhist elements in it, and the practice is it can be quite similar.
All right. How about, let's have I wonder if if the Nats have been famously known for doing anything in the past, and then this kind of ties in with how elites propagate belief and emulation in the citizenry and stuff like that. Like, how connected were the Nats to the monarchy, which fell in 1885?
Yeah, very connected. From the documents we have and the art and architecture that we have, we know that in Bagan they were part of certainly of the artistic scene, especially the Dewa Nats. The Dewa Nats are everywhere in early Burmese art, and everywhere in Bagan there are representations of the Jamin and Biama or Brahma, who's also seen as a Nat. Even the Buddha can be seen as a Nat of the very, very highest kind. He's known as the Vibhuti Nat. So lots of them at Bagan. Whether there were what we call I term the indigenous Nats, more the spirits of fields and trees and so on. I would have to say there would definitely have been them there, because the belief is so old, but they're not something that's left in the material record. So there are a lot of ceramic plaques at Bagan and little wall paintings that show tree nats, but the tree nat is always depicted as a kind of a human figure, sometimes with a crown, and they're kind of like coming out of a tree. And so, I mean, that's a fundamental nature spirit nat, and they're very much part of the Jataka tales, and where the Buddha in his former life was a tree nat, and so they're seen quite prominently at Bagan. But in terms of the monarchy, when Anuruddha started the Shwesagon pagoda at Bagan, and then he died, and his not his next successor, but the one after that, King Chansada, he finished the Shwesagon, and there are images of nats there that were placed there to guard the pagoda and its sacred relics. And according to the lists that the trustees of the pagoda have, some of those nats were Dewa, and a lot of them were indigenous nats. So nats like Minbushin, who's the Lord of the White Horse, who's represented by a white horse puppet you see around in shrines, he was one of the nats that guarded the Shwesagon. Yeah, so they were sort of pressed into the service by royalty to guard this very important pagoda. And then later on, we know in the mid-1600s, a king called Pindale Min, he appointed nats as the guardians of the 12 gates to his royal city at Falun. And they were also indigenous nats, and these were the nats that became known as the first pantheon of the 37 nats, even though there was actually only 15 of them. And then later kings, when they had their pantheons of 37 nats, the ones from Pindale Min's 15 were included, and then others were added. And then by the time we got to the end of the monarchy in 1885, there were 3 different pantheons of 37 nats that were actually guardians of Mandalay, of the royal palace. So the ones that we think of today as the 37 nats were there, and they were based largely on Pindale Min's pantheon.
It seems that by most counts there are, like you said, these three pantheons of 37 nats, even though some of them may not have had 37 nats originally.
That's
And
right.
then there's two positions of nats. There's a tet upper
Mm-hmm.
or out lower.
Lower.
And
That's right.
then there's also groups of families of nats.
Yeah,
So,
it gets really confusing.
but you've still had the courage to publish lists under your own name.
Oh,
So
no.
how many nats actually are there?
Gazillions. There's a gnat in every tree. So a gnat in every river, a gnat in every, even large buildings have gnats, hotels, airports. Yeah, man-made objects, computers, machines. The gnats can literally, be innumerable, millions and millions of them out there. Yeah, I mean, you're never going to, you can't kind of chunk it down to, a list of, right, there are only 4,000 and whatever. But the distinction between a tet and alp, or upper and lower, is an important one, because the tet nats are the ones that are more associated with Buddhism. So they're the Dewa that live in the heavens, like Thajamin and Byama, and they're the ones that are seen as benevolent. They don't really have a nasty side at all. They're just there to help you, and they will often, they will help Buddhist practitioners along, their Buddhist way. Whereas the outlier nats, the lower ones, are the ones that, I think of as indigenous, that sort of sprang from the land originally, or from mountains, or, rivers, that kind of thing. And were probably around long before Buddhism came into the country. You think back to pretty much every culture in the world has some sort of animist tradition, and that's where the nats sat, before Buddhism or Hinduism or any other belief system came into the country. So when it did arrive on early votive tablets, the inscriptions will often say that this offering has been made, or this dedication of a religious foundation has been made to honour the nats. So they didn't use an imported Pali word like Dewa. They used the word nat. And my belief is that that's because it was a perfectly ordinary, useful word that everyone understood at the time. And the incoming belief, they just used their own word for those sort of incoming concepts of benevolent Dewa. The upper and lower is sort of the category that the various nats fall into. And when you get to the different types of pantheons of nats, one pantheon is seen as a tet, and they're 37 nats from a Buddhist sutta that is chanted, the Atanatiya Sutta, and it's a chant that Buddhist believers can do when they're beset by evil, or to ward off evil. And these 37 nats all have Pali names, because it's part of the incoming belief system. And the only set of images of them that I'm aware of are at the Ananda temple in Bagan, and they're part of the frieze of plaques, these sort of green ceramic plaques that run around the base of the Ananda. So going from one direction, I can't remember whether it's south to north or north to south, it's the parade of benevolent beings, including these 37 Atet nats, and then the other side is the march of Mara's army with all the demons and so on. So next time you go to Bagan, you can check that out. But that's the only pantheon of Atet nats. And then the out nats, the lower nats, have a couple of pantheons, and one of them is the 37 nats that started with Pindale Min and went through to the end of the monarchy under Minden and Tibor. So that pantheon is very much indigenous nats, although there are different lists, but one of the lists has the Jarman, who's the Atet nat, the out nat, at the head of the pantheon of the lower nats. So that is usually seen as a way of enfolding the nats within Buddhism, like the indigenous nats within Buddhism, because this pantheon was formed, and they put the highest Buddhist Nat they could find at the head of it. But it still is really an Indigenous pantheon, and the Nats, whether you could say that the Nats were Buddhist in that respect is, a moot point.
It does sound quite varied and a little bit confusing, especially if you're just average Joe on the streets of Yangon. So how do we know what we know about the Nats today, and how do average people in Myanmar know what they know about Nats? Is this taught in monasteries, or is this taught in schools? And were there any particularly influential English language scholars?
Well, from the English Western point of view, what we know historically about the Nats started with English colonial memoirs, or even earlier, there were, Portuguese travellers who mentioned Nats, so going back to maybe the 1700s. But the average person on the street in Myanmar, when they talk about Nats, they'd be referring to the lower Nats, the Indigenous ones, and they're the ones whose images you see around in the streets. They might be, little images of a Nat tucked into a tree, or by a tree, or at a crossroads, or on the outskirts of a stupa or a temple. You often find shrines. Certainly, the visual representations of their stories are everywhere in Myanmar, so you don't have to go very far to see, and there are probably half a dozen that recur over and over. Once you know what they are, you start seeing them everywhere. So I don't think they'd be taught in schools. Monasteries, perhaps. I suppose it would depend on the abbot. The Atet Nats, like the Jamin and Brahma, they would certainly be taught in monasteries. But I think most people would learn about the Nats through oral tradition and just the practices of their family. In the past, you had a sort of a caste of Nats that looked after you, and one of them, or two of them, were the Nats from your mother and father's place of origin. And back in the early days of colonial rule, there was a colonial researcher who wrote that because the movement of people around Myanmar before the British came in, it was quite limited. People were born, grew up, and died largely in their own village. Everyone sort of had the same hereditary Nat. But then once people started moving around, this fellow said, well, you could actually study movements of populations around Myanmar by asking people who their family Nat was. So I think that's probably true to a large extent today in families that do pay homage to the Nats. Then they would have these familial Nats, and they may live in Yangon but pay homage to an Upper Burmese Burma Nat, but still acknowledge the Nats from the area that they're living in. One really great example, a friend of mine, an anthropologist called Kezia Wallace in New Zealand, she actually did some study of the Nats down in Bago. And one of the very important Nats you see around, and you see her in Yangon as well, is Nan Karain Maydor. And she's usually depicted as a lady with a big buffalo headdress on. She's known as Bago Maydor as well, the royal mother of Bago. Her legend is that she was initially a buffalo who used to graze in the fields around the palace. And one day, this is very brief retelling, but one day a prince wandered away from the palace and got lost, and so the buffalo adopted him and raised him along with her own, buffalo calves. And when the prince grew up, he said, I'm really sorry, but I have to go and find humans. So he went back and he turned up at the palace, and the king at the time went, it's my long lost prince. Come in and, be my heir. So that was that. And then the palace was alerted that there was this rampaging buffalo causing lots of damage, and the prince was ordered to go out and kill it. And as he was out on the hunt, he realised that the buffalo was actually his buffalo mother. And cut a long story short, she was slain and she became the Nat, Bago Maydor. So she's very much a Mon Nat, but she's associated with the Mon monarchy. But then fast forward, several hundred years, when movement of people around Myanmar became very common. And the British needed workers for the rice fields down in Lower Myanmar, and Min Min at the time allowed male migrants only. He didn't allow the women, but he allowed the men to go from Upper Myanmar down to Lower Myanmar to help with the rice harvest. So these men came in and they brought with them Min Bu Shen Nat, who's the Lord of the White Horse. So all of a sudden, you've now, and then once these men arrived, they got together with the Mon women who worshipped Bago Mador. And so now you have people down in, the lower end of Myanmar who pay homage to an upper Myanmar Nat, whereas probably 200 years ago, that would have been extremely rare.
Yeah, the phenomenon of domestic migration is just huge in Myanmar, but is not really talked about or tracked statistically. And I can imagine that this kind of stuff would be really important when people are living in dormitories and they meet people from their hometowns.
That's right.
These are the kinds of things they bond on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, we have a great example there of a buffalo becoming a nat, but can people become nats? How does that happen? And then can nats become people or inhabit them?
Absolutely. Yes, there's a lot of many nats were people in their former existences. So there's even a couple of kings. Alaun Satu became the Nat Min Situ after he died. So basically what happens is the general belief is that if you die a very sudden or violent death, your Lakpia, which is your butterfly spirit, and the closest analogy to that in the West would be a soul, it doesn't have a chance to kind of settle, and it kind of is out there wandering around, and it becomes a nat. So the people become a nat by kind of going through this process of violent or sudden death. But people can also become nats through, and I don't know a lot about this, this is more in the realms of anthropology, but there are cases of nats that have become nats not really through suffering a violent or unusual death, but because the people seem to have decided that they were nats. But generally, when you poke into the histories of most of them, you'll find an accident or a death of some sort. Sometimes the king is involved or royalty is involved, and that's not uncommon with the pantheons, part of protecting the royal palaces, the pantheons of 37. But there are also, gazillions of nats around the place of local people who died and became a nat. Or there was a famous one in the war with the Japanese. There was a village where there was an English officer who was stationed there, and when the Japanese came, he fought alongside the men of the village to try and protect the village from the invasion, and he was killed, and he became a nat. And because there was a shrine, and I'm not sure if there was an image of him or not, but the villagers used to offer him English tea instead of pickled tea. Because he was English. So they would get, Earl Grey or English breakfast or something, and that was the offering that they used to make for him. So there's lots of stories like that in villages. You go around the country, you can find examples of those. With nats becoming human, I don't know of any particular stories. There are. There is certainly a belief that the nats are part of, one of the realms of existence. So theoretically, they can be helped by being encouraged to do benevolent deeds to move them along the path of Buddhism. So in their next existence, they would come back as something higher than a nat. So certainly a nat could become human via that process. And I know there are a lot of people who feel that making offerings to the nats is actually going to help them along the nats' own path of self-actualization and becoming more Buddhist, if you like, or more further up the food chain.
Okay, and what about being inhabited by a gnat, the Nakador and stuff like that?
Yeah. Nakadora are sort of professional spirit mediums. They're people that have an ability to encourage the nat to come and inhabit them. And so people can interact one-on-one with the nat via the Nakador. So she or he is a vector for that to happen. But other people can be inhabited by gnats. So it's something people are very afraid of, partly because the gnat might cause you to do something that is really against Buddhist norms, like singing or dancing wildly, or behaving in an improper manner. I think when people go to Nat Way, where Nat Kadors are dancing and asking the Nat to manifest itself, I think the onlookers are actually quite, oh gee, do we want him to come? Do we don't want him to come? Because I don't want to do anything that might embarrass myself. So it's this kind of I think there's a bit of a tension there of excitement and fear.
Let's go back to earlier in the conversation where you were talking about indigenous gnats and old tree spirits. So what's this distinction between an indigenous and a non-indigenous gnat? And I know that there's supposed to be this ancient tradition of constructing houses for tree spirits out of the wood. So when you chop down a tree,
that's right,
you've destroyed a home and you need to
that's
rebuild
right.
something. So what is this connection between, tree spirits? Are these like the very first sort of gnats? And is there a connection between trees and all gnats?
A lot of gnats live in trees. A lot of them don't. But yes, I think the tradition with trees goes way back to pre-recorded history with animist beliefs that spirits inhabited mountains and rivers and prominent trees and so on. So yes, the tradition of whenever you cut down timber, you would make an offering to the tree nat. At what point that turned into, we're going to make you a house so you can live in, the nat can live in the house, the shrine, as opposed to living in the planks of sawn wood or whatever. When that started to happen, I don't think anyone knows. But the tree nats were probably the earliest, indigenous nats. And then the later nats that came along that, were the spirits of people who died violent deaths, they're also indigenous. The gnats of the road or the machines, they're also, what I would think of as indigenous because they've come sort of from the people. And it's the Apa, the Atet gnats, who are the sort of imported Dewa from Hinduism and Buddhism and Brahmanism and so on. Yeah.
Okay, so that distinction's a bit clearer. So I wonder whether people in Myanmar and scholars consider gnats to be part of Buddhism, or you've already said that they sort of precede Buddhism.
Yeah.
And connected to that, there's a lot of other people in Myanmar that are not Buddhists. So do Myanmar Muslims and Christians and Hindus believe in gnats?
I'll answer that last one first. Yeah, I believe the Karen, who are largely Christian, also have their own nats. Every ethnicity around Myanmar, to my knowledge, have their own particular nats. So there are Shan nats and Kayin nats and so on and so forth. The ones that I researched were mainly the ones in the Burma heartland. Whether they're part of Buddhism, well, I believe they certainly preceded Buddhism as animist traditions of, the nat of the mountain and the tree and the stream and so on. And I think Buddhism is quite egalitarian in that anyone, anyone can study the scriptures and make their own path in Buddhism. And so I think when Buddhist beliefs came in, it would largely have been limited to the elites to start with anyway. So, it was the kings and so on that were building all these Buddhist monuments and so forth. And I think a lot of the people who lived in the villages around were probably like, oh, the king's building another temple, well, that's great. But they were paying homage, to their nat, really, until Buddhism just became, gradually became so dominant. So yes, they are part of Buddhism. You can certainly be a devout Buddhist and still pay homage to Nats. And U Nu was a great example of that. He was actually quite a known Buddhist scholar in his own right, but he also had believed in the Nats, and he spent quite a lot of government money on Nats. He commissioned a couple of very important Nat statues at Mount Popa. He gave the inaugural, I love this, he gave the inaugural address of the Buddha Study Centre at Illinois University when it first opened, and his lecture was on the Nats. So if you asked U Nu, he would say absolutely the Nats are part of Buddhism. But then you could ask another devout Buddhist and they would say, oh, no, that's a folk tradition and it's, it has nothing to do with the Buddha. Like all belief systems, there are shades of grey, big shades of grey.
So, Sally, you have a book coming out on Nats, and particularly the visual representation of Nats. So why Nats are depicted in some ways and how their depiction has changed over time.
That's right.
Please tell us all about it.
Hopefully it'll be a really good book. It's largely based on my PhD thesis, which was how the Nats, as an art historian, I looked at how representations of the Nats began and how they have changed into the kind of images that we see now. There was this huge trajectory that went from perhaps an outline on a tree to a little image that the oldest ones that we have are wood, and then they've been lacquered and then covered in gold leaf, and that's it, they're just gold. And then later and later they got more decorative, and there was lacquer moulding, and there were bits of mosaic glass, sequins, they got costumes. The tradition of swathing them in textiles is something that probably came from Buddhism, where, the Buddha is offered robes and scarves and that sort of thing. So, there's this sort of, and it just morphed into this full or larger than life size mannequins. And they were introduced, oddly enough, by a monk who lived at Mount Popa. And he had quite a lot of money, and he actually believed that he was a Nat in a former life, a Nat called Popa Mador, who's the lady of the royal lady of, or royal mother of Mount Popa. And so he commissioned a woodcarver to carve images of the Nats for him, and he created this enormous shrine that's at the base of Popa Town Kalat, which is the volcanic plug with all the shrines on it and the monkeys. And so opposite one of the entrances, there's an enormous big pavilion there with all these statues that were made by U Ba Tin, who was the woodcarver. And he was chosen because he was famous for being able to create beautiful images of humans. So this monk kind of in one commission almost made this leap from smaller statues, into this sort of mannequin style, and that's been copied. So there's now lots of Nat shrines around that have these sort of very modern images, as opposed to the smaller gold leaf ones. But they're still made as well. They're still the more traditional sort of Nat image is still probably more prevalent because they're bought for home shrines and Nat Gador and others. I mean, Mandalay's full of shops where you can buy Nat images.
Well, that's interesting. I'm thinking about if he was indeed a Nat in his previous life, then we might be seeing the Nat hegemon trying to sort of influence the style of representation.
Yeah, he was a very interesting guy. He, after he built that shrine, he went to live on Mount Popa, and he decided he was then a Zorji, a wizard, and he could fly and so on. And then he came back to Popa Town Kalat, and he commissioned another Nat shrine with images which is further up the hill from the main area where the tourists go. And that shrine, the images are the same style, but they were made by the original woodcarver's son.
Okay, now after all these years of research and writing articles and a PhD and a book, you have to have a favourite Nat. So who is your favourite Nat and why?
Oh, I've got lots of favourite Nats. I'm actually very fond of Mashwe U, mainly because of her story. I think she was a weaver, or she was a Burmese wife who was very well known for her weaving, and she married her husband was a woodcutter, and one day as he was away cutting wood,
and she was weaving away at her loom. The Talmbion brothers, who are also famous Nats that I was speaking about earlier, they came along, and one of them fell in love with her and tried to seduce her. And, she kept spurning his advances, and eventually he, when her husband was away floating logs down the river, the Talmbion brother caused the bindings of the logs to unravel, and the husband fell into the river and drowned. And he also became a Nat. But the brother's intention was that, well, now Mashwayu is a widow, she'll come with me. And she still spurned his advances. So he sent his tiger, because he can ride a tiger, he sent his tiger to drag Mashwayu away from her loom. And she was killed and she became a Nat. So the place where this actually happened is not too far outside of Mandalay, and it's actually called Mashwayu Myo, so the village of Mashwayu. And there's several shrines to her there. But I really love her. I mean, aside from the virtuous wife story, which I think really is sort of a bit of a parable for women in Myanmar. The way she's depicted in art is great. It's always her being dragged away by the tiger. And at the Shwedagon, on one of the beautiful pavilions that you have there, the ones that have got lots and lots of intricate carvings, there's a fabulous one of Mashwayu, and she's like, being dragged away by the tiger. And then above, the Talmbion brother is on his horse, and he's sort of watching, this whole thing unfold. So now when I go around pagodas and I see that there are lots of carvings, I look for this story because it's a really popular one. So I've seen quite a few modern paintings of the Nat stories, and Mashwayu's one of them. Yeah, I like it. It's a good one.
I think that I have a favourite. So I've heard of Min Jaw as the Nat for gamblers and drunkards. Do you know anything about him?
I do. I can show you. So this is my...
oh, wow.
This is a statue, Min Jaw, that I bought in Myanmar. And he has his little bottle of Johnny Walker, because the offering to this Nat is always alcohol. So often Scotch whiskey, but sometimes, Myanmar rum. But usually, if you can afford it, you're going to buy the Johnny Walker. And this little statue of him, he has his toddy pot for his alcohol, and he's got his fighting rooster. You can see that. But anyway, so he is the Nat for drunkards and gamblers. He's very, very popular, and possibly because he's a great excuse if you go to the Nat Quay and Koji Jaw is one of the Nats that's being honoured, then, the whiskey flows freely, and there's lots of singing and dancing, and everyone has a very, very good time. So he is, yeah, so he's a good Nat. What
a guy. All right, the last question we always do on this program is to ask our guest for a recommendation. So this is something, anything to do with Myanmar that you like. It can be, completely left field. It can be a restaurant, or it can be anything.
Sure. Okay. There's lots of things that I really love to do. The obvious ones, like, going to the Shwedagon at sunset. Everyone probably thinks of that. But one of the things that I always do when I go to Yangon is visit the, as an art historian especially, is visit the art galleries. And there's a great gallery, Nawade Thalar, which is kind of on the street that runs behind the Park Royal Hotel in Yangon. And Pie Wei, the owner and the curator there, he just has wonderful art on display, and he changes the displays quite regularly. There's lots of different artists shows there, and it's a really lovely hub for artists and other creative types to get together. He has lots of events. It's a really, really cool place to go. I always want to spend thousands of dollars on the art, and, never do because I don't have the money. But, yeah, that's a great place to go.
Great recommendation on Yorminji Road, and there's some awesome restaurants around there too.
There are, yeah.
Make a day of it. All right, well, thank you so much, Sally, for coming on Myanmar Musings. It's been really interesting hearing about how the Nats, their history and how they're interwoven with Myanmar culture today.
Oh, you're welcome.